Tell you what, 90 degrees in July is not bad for here, correct? Feels pretty good. And if you're watching from somewhere else, you're like, what? What is going on? But for us, man, today is a nice day, and it's good to be back with you live. My family got away for a little vacation, a much-needed vacation. Thank you for letting us get away here. It was a little over a week ago, actually, and our youngest son was invited to play in a baseball tournament in Orange County. And so we turned that into a family vacation and hung out in Lake Forest and Huntington Beach and, suffering for Jesus in Newport Beach, California, and although it was hot there for them, like their locals were complaining about the heat, but he did great, by the way. He pitched a little over 4 innings in 3 games, no runs scored against him, so his ERA was 0, struck out 8 batters, only walked 1, so he did fantastic. It's fun to watch him succeed there. And then both my boys started school this week. They're on a year-round schedule, so summers are pretty short here. They get better breaks throughout the year. And my oldest started high school this week, and I dropped them off at school. And it took me a good hour to stop, get the tears out of my eyes as I was watching him walk down the sidewalk, and then went back home. And it comes at you fast, doesn't it? And they grow up fast. So I wanted to share a picture. A few weeks ago, my boys decided that they wanted Frosted Tips. So we took him to where Hannah gets her hair done, and they got Frosted Tips. And I was just messing with them. I'm like, you guys kind of look like you're in a boy band. And so now because I'm thinking 25 years ago, Frosted Tips, hemp necklaces, anybody know what I'm talking about? And they're trolling me now. Like my little guy's like, tell me why. And the oldest guy's like, I want it that way. So I'm getting trolled by the Backstreet Boys. That's what we're up to right now. And it was good to get away and get a little bit of vacation time. And it's good to be back with you. We have something else to celebrate today. So we started the well in 2018, which sounds like a really long time ago. But it was 11 months before COVID hit. So when COVID happened, we were shut down and online for over a year, and we essentially had to relaunch the well. And that was 4 years ago this weekend that we relaunched the well. And this is what it looked like at a little elementary school. Now, people are on vacation here, and this auditorium seats 500 people. But this is what the well looked like 4 years ago this weekend. Look how far we've come. Do you think that's something to celebrate this morning? Look what God has done. In this congregation, this amazing group of people. I was here for Road Crew and just looking around and seeing the amazing people who God has brought here. We have a lot to celebrate, even though it's still summertime, even though, kind of going back to school, summer's still on vacation, but we have a lot to celebrate here as a church. And as we look forward to the year ahead, a lot to celebrate that is going to be coming here in the near future. So this series that we're in right now is about making it through difficult times when you're tempted to feel discouraged, when you're in the dog days of summer, in the summertime blues, and we live in a difficult time. And you may feel like this summer is more difficult than others. It may not be exactly what you wish it was. You may feel like that, let's be honest, more than just the summertime. Maybe you're in a season of your life, or maybe it's something that you have struggled with for a long time, where you feel, the blues. Maybe you struggle with anxiety, depression, melancholy, and so maybe it's not just the summertime blues for you, but this is a 5-week series on the prophet Elijah from the Old Testament. And Elijah faced stress over political realities in his country. That's what really kicked off his public ministry. He faced financial anxiety, and he faced loneliness. And he's one of the most prominent Bible characters who I think it's safe to say clearly struggled with depression. And we'll see this again today, where he just kind of goes up and down. He has highs, but he has some deep lows as he navigates his life. And we're going to see more this week and next how God interacted with Elijah in his journey and discover practices that maybe we can adopt if we're feeling the summertime blues, to find greater peace, less stress, less anxiety. And I want to share a little bit about what I've learned as well that's helped me over the years. So on week 1, we saw that wicked rulers had taken over the country as king and queen in Israel. Do you remember their names? Ahab and Jezebel. And they introduced a new religion, but the way that it works, we don't want to look at this like a cartoon, right? We want to see this in reality. They brought a new set of values that Elijah's people were not used to living under. They worshiped the god Baal. Part of that was the act of child sacrifice, which of course is insane and sounds completely foreign to us. But this is 3,000 years ago on the other side of the planet. But it was a fertility cult. That's what that is, the worship of Baal, that's fueled by anxiety, human anxiety, right? Fear. If it doesn't rain, then the crops don't grow and our children don't live. And so out of this, humans are capable of good things and all kinds of irrational, terrible things as well. Out of this fear and this anxiety came this belief, well, we want it to rain, and so perhaps there's a rain god, and we value our children, and if we want our children to live because there's rain and there's crops, maybe we need to appease the rain god to give us rain. And so the practice of child sacrifice arose, and Ahab and Jezebel brought that kind of a worldview into Elijah's country. They were also just selfish, egotistical, narcissistic rulers. They seized people on the streets. They took people's properties. They violently persecuted people. And it was all to enrich themselves and just to make themselves look good. And it's in that environment that Elijah rose up, just suddenly came out of nowhere and started speaking truth to power. And so last week we read about how Elijah seemed to be struggling in the depths of despair. He was suicidal when he heard that Ahab and Jezebel were coming for him, and he was praying to God that he would die. And then an angel appeared to him and made breakfast for him, gave him food, gave him water, and he got sleep, right? And we saw that the natural rhythms of life are still important because we're human beings, and we need healthy food and to drink water and to get physical movement and to get sleep. And it's like God reminded Elijah that he's only human. And there's only so much you can do, and I want this to be sustainable for you, and helps get Elijah back up on his feet again today. And then today we're going to talk about how the angel told him to go to a mountain, and the idea there is that he's going to encounter God in perhaps some spectacular, amazing way on this mountain. And so today we're talking about what to do, because this is where Elijah was, when God feels distant to you or perhaps non-existent. When God is silent or you feel like God is nowhere to be found, in a couple of different ways. The first way is maybe you see what's going on in our world and you're like, where's God in this? Why does God allow this to happen? How does a good God allow the world to spin out of control at times like it seems to be? And where is God in that? And maybe that's a question that you struggle with. Why doesn't God do something? And then the second way is maybe you're looking for guidance. Maybe there's some decision that you have to make, or you're looking for a path or purpose or a way forward, and you're not seeing the signs that you would like to see. You feel like, man, I'm looking for guidance. I'm praying for the right thing. I'm looking for a path, and I just don't see the way forward. Maybe God's not there guiding me. Whatever your view is, and so you wish that God would kind of show up and give you some clear guidance, but that hasn't happened. We're going to see what that looked like in Elijah's life now. So as the angel told him, Elijah fled to Mount Horeb, which is the same mountain as Mount Sinai. Who received the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai? That was a freebie right there. That was an easy one. So Moses met God, encountered God on Mount Sinai. Elijah goes to the same mountain to encounter God. And then this is what we read. This comes from 1 Kings chapter 19. And the word of the Lord came to him, Elijah. What are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. Verse 11, the Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. This is the same way that God passed by Moses on Mount Sinai. So he's hearkening back to this time. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I've been very zealous." It looks like something's gotten confused here. So let's go to 15. The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came," and we can go to the next slide. Here we go. "To the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint," and we just have several names here, several action steps. "Hazael, king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat from Abel Meholah, to succeed you as a prophet. And then Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, whose mouths have not kissed him." We're stepping back in 3,000 years on the other side of the planet. We've got kings putting people to death by the sword. God seems to condone that. That raises questions we talked about in week 1, if you didn't hear that message. But what is happening here is that Elijah is at a place in his life where he feels like he needs to hear something from God. He needs an encounter from God. Maybe you have been there. You're just like, "Man, God, where are you?" And looking for an answer. And maybe you wouldn't use, depending on where you are in your spiritual journey, maybe you wouldn't use super religious terms like that, but you're just looking for guidance, or why are things the way they are? And Elijah is at a place where he just has to do something. He has to do something to encounter God and get answers. So he's like, you know what? Sinai worked for Moses. And so I'm going to go there and encounter God. And Elijah went there planning to have an encounter with God that was some dramatic, spectacular thing where God would pass by and speak to him in the way that God spoke to Moses, and apparently, and he had this expectation of what this encounter with God would look like. Now, we have expectations for what God should do, we think, in our lives, and how God should speak to us, and how God should work in our lives, and how God should guide us. And let's be honest, not about you, but often God does not meet those expectations. And then there are people who, they probably mean well, but they're just the ultra-religious folks who act like hearing from God or having an encounter with God is just such a normal, everyday thing. And you read it like this in this passage, and the Lord said, "Go do this." And Elijah's like, "Okay, great, God, thank you." And there are people who seem to kind of talk about their relationship with God in those terms. And maybe you feel like, man, that's just not me. That's not how I experience God. And so there are all kinds of things going on in this desire for an encounter with God. So last Thursday night, my family and I, another thing we did, we got to go see the Superman movie. Has anybody seen Superman, the new movie? Did you like the movie? Excellent. So some of you got to see it already. I'm not gonna spoil it for you. I really liked the movie. I thought it was a bold statement. It took some courage to say some things that they said in the movie. And for me, it was a movie about right and wrong, and about kindness, and how we treat people that we think are different from us. And highly appropriate in this time. I highly recommend it. I've been a Superman fan since the Christopher Reeve movies came out in the late 1970s. When I was a kid, I saw Superman in a drive-in theater. You remember those, right? It was a long, long time ago. In a drive-in theater where you pull the car up and you put like a tin can on your window, and that's where the sound comes out. And it sounded very much like that. And you got the big screen there. And I was instantly mesmerized. I became a Superman fan. Superman was my hero when I was a kid. I wore red underoos and put on a cape and jumped off furniture for the next 5 years. I love the Christopher Reeve Superman movies. And Superman is essentially the Jewish Messiah. He was created by two Jewish kids in Cleveland in the 1930s. And he is a divine-like warrior hero who shows up from somewhere else and saves the day, a messianic character. And in Jewish history, especially in times of distress, when anxiety was high and people felt depressed and despair and discouraged, there was this hope of the Messiah, that the Messiah would come, that God would send the Messiah, Mashiach in Hebrew, like this divine warrior superhero, this Superman, who would swoop in and kick our enemies out and stand up for us and protect us and save the day. And if we're honest, I think our default mode, and including mine, is when we have expectations for God about how God is going to speak to us or guide us or lead us, and God, where are you? And we expect God to be Superman. We expect God to be this messianic character from the Old Testament, the Superman who will just swoop in, show up in a powerful, spectacular way, instantly vanquish our enemies, make the path clear, right? Instantly stand up against evil, and it'll all be taken care of, and everything's tied up with a nice bow by the end of the movie. And then God will put his Clark Kent glasses back on and then go somewhere else until we need him again. That's the expectation that many of us, including me, have had of how God will act in our lives, God will work in our lives, speak in our lives. And Elijah was in a time when he wanted God to swoop in like Superman. He wanted to encounter God in a dramatic, powerful way. And so he goes to where Moses had encountered God with that hope. Now, you remember from week 1 that Ahab and Jezebel worshiped the god Baal. We talked about that a little bit at the beginning of the sermon again. And Baal was the rain god, the storm god. Again, if you're praying for the crops to grow, you want to feed your children, you need rain. And so Baal, for many people, was the source of their life. And praying to Baal and wanting Baal to act in the form of a dramatic thunderstorm was anxiety relieving. You see how that works. And Baal was often depicted with a lightning bolt in his hands. He was a prototype of Zeus. And so you remember that the prophets of Baal would pray, and then they hoped a storm would come and see lightning bolts and wind, right, in a powerful, dramatic way. Well, Elijah goes on to the mountain, and there's a windstorm, typical for what you would want if you were a worshiper of Baal. But God, the God of Elijah, was not in that windstorm. And then there was an earthquake, and the ground shook, and it was dramatic and so on, but God was not in that. And this is mysterious language, of course. But Elijah did not encounter God in that dramatic event. And then there was fire from God. I don't know what that would have seemed like. The Hebrew has a different word for lightning, but perhaps it was lightning. It would make sense with, being contrasted with Baal worship, but God was not in that either. So interesting, okay, we're in a foreign place here as we read this passage, but he apparently, like the people of his time, like us, he wanted to encounter God in this amazing, flashy, a memorable, dramatic way, but God was not in those dramatic weather events. God did not manifest in a loud, flashy, dramatic way where there was a clear sign. That's not how God spoke to Elijah. After the windstorm and the earthquake and the fire, and God was not found in them, the NIV translation that we read here says, there came a gentle whisper, right? And this is the part of the sermon I've been excited to get to, so I've been kind of speeding my way. This is one of the times when, just Googling, you can Google passages in Hebrew and Greek, and you can find a lot of good information on the internet now if you're into studying the Bible, or having a good Bible commentary is helpful. And this is one of those times where the original language uncovers something that is just amazing. And I love this, and I've been excited to share this with you. If you feel like, man, God is just not speaking to me, God is not acting in the way that I want, I'm searching for guidance, or I wish God would do something, and God isn't showing up the way that I would like. Here's what the original Hebrew says. It wasn't a gentle whisper. After the windstorm and the earthquake and the fire, the Hebrew says, there came the voice of silence. The sound of silence, the voice of silence. In the original Hebrew, it's an oxymoron that the English translations just don't pick up. And this is huge. If you've been discouraged or waiting for God to show up dramatically or give you a sign, right, or give you guidance in some way or show up and take care of something, God speaks to us, usually, in the voice of silence. This is huge. So Abraham Joshua Heschel was a famous Jewish theologian in the mid-20th century, back in the 1900s, a really long time ago. And in 1956, he wrote a book called God in Search of Man, using man to mean humankind in 1950s style, a philosophy of Judaism. And on page 188, he writes that God does communicate with people. As a Jewish theologian, he believes God communicates with people, but listen to how Heschel describes this. However, in being told that God addressed the prophets and spoke to them, our minds are merely to receive a notion that there is a divine knowledge to which the prophets attain. We are to be impressed with the idea that the things which the prophets did communicate to us come from the Lord and are not altogether the product of their conceptions and ideas. So God is speaking, Heschel says. We must not suppose that in speaking, God employed voice or sound. In this part, I didn't write this, this is Heschel. Every intelligent person knows that when the Bible asserts that the people saw or heard the voice at Sinai, it does not refer to a perception by the eye or a perception by the ear, but to a spiritual perception. And the way I was raised in, high-octane evangelical churches, man, that would have been news to me because, although people didn't talk about hearing God audibly a lot, like they talked, I was praying the other day and God told me, and I'm like, wow, okay, that's cool, right? And God hasn't spoken to me that clearly. Maybe something's wrong with me. And maybe people like this. I've met two people in my life who would pray to God to show them a good parking place. Like when they go to the store, like, Lord, could you lead me to a good parking? And they were mobile people, And so and they're like, the Lord told me there was a parking place near aisle 1. What? I'm okay. God doesn't speak to me like that. I wish I had that kind of relationship with God. And so in my world, folks would talk about hearing from God as though it almost was a voice. And just that was just normal, something all the time. And they just got guidance from God so easily, and God showed up so easily and so routinely in their lives. The Hebrew says here that God, it says there came the voice of silence. In other words, if we were just to go back here, Elijah didn't hear anything with his ears. It's important to say. It's important to be clear, I think, as we read this passage. And Jewish commentators seem to agree. The Lord said, do this, Elijah. Okay, I'll go over here. The Hebrew seems to indicate Elijah didn't hear anything with his ears. It's important, isn't it? And at the same time, Elijah realizes that something is happening in this silence. It wasn't the windstorm, the earthquake, the fire, but he's having some kind of a realization that he's very aware of. It's hitting him hard here. It says when he heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face, like in reverence. This something sacred is happening. And he went out and stood at the mouth of the cave like Moses. And the voice, okay, but this is the voice of silence, we've just been told. Elijah, what are you doing here? What are you doing here, Elijah? Now, part of this depends on how you interpret the Bible. Some people interpret the Bible like it's an IKEA manual, step by step, putting together the furniture, and it's just easy, and it's all literal. And I always seem to miss something in a step, though, and I have to go back and redo a couple of steps again. So the IKEA manuals aren't easy for me, but other people understand the Bible a little more poetically than that, a little more artistically than that. I think in our language, and this may be your view, it may not be. If you disagree with me, that's okay. I'm okay with that. It may be that in our language, what is happening here is that Elijah is desperate to hear from God, and he goes to a place that worked for somebody before. He's at a place in his life where he's like, God, I need you to show up, and I just don't feel like you're showing up. Now, we just read things about angels feeding him and all this, right? So we have questions about the passage. But Elijah's on a roller coaster, and he really experiences the lows, and many of us can identify with that. And so he goes looking for an encounter with God. And in this time, he pours out his heart to God. I want people to worship you. I'm sick of what I'm seeing in society with these new politicians, Ahab and Jezebel, and what they're doing to our country. I feel alone. He says, I'm alone. He pours his heart out to God. He vents. Perhaps there's some experience of catharsis. He gets away from it all in the silence, like Jackie talked about today. And he pours his heart out. There's a windstorm and all that kind of stuff. But after pouring his heart out, perhaps he stands up and he has this realization. I think that's how we would say it in our language. This realization. And I would imagine that this is stuff that's been going on in his heart and his mind for a long time. He has this realization. And he knows that something is happening. He goes to the mouth of the cave. He believes that he's encountering God. There is an inaudible voice. But he's having a realization of who he is and what the truth is and what's really going on. Now, in your interpretation of the Bible, it might be really important for you to kind of believe that God audibly spoke to Elijah, and that's fine if that's your interpretation. I read this now more like he goes to the mouth of the cave, and the Lord says to him, right, it's the voice of silence, Elijah, what are you doing here? And I kind of picture that like he walks to the mouth of the cave, and he knows deep in his heart he's having a conversation with God. He's not hearing a voice, right? It's not like two people, right? Somebody standing next to him. But in his heart, in his mind, he's standing at the mouth of the cave, and he's like, yeah, what am I doing here? Right? Like, I believe that God was speaking to him, but not in an audible voice. And he's having realizations, what am I doing here? Yeah, I'm out here on a mountain. I'm searching for God. And what's the truth? I'm not alone. He's poured his heart out, right? I'm not alone. There are thousands of people in my country who haven't bowed the knee to Baal and Ahab and Jezebel. I'm not alone. And as a matter of fact, I'm out here in this desert, far away from my people and where I should be, and apparently it was important for him to get away, right? There's a rhythm to life. But what I need to do, I need to get back there. I need to get back to the desert of Damascus, where I was before, right? If you remember what we read in the passage. And again, I believe that God was making impressions on him. I believe that God was communicating with him, but not in a voice he could hear. And Elijah's like, yeah, I'm gonna go anoint Hazael over Aram, and I'm gonna anoint Jehu, and then I'm gonna anoint Elisha. Yeah, that's what I'm gonna do. Yeah, and maybe in his mind he's conversing with God. Yeah, God, that is what I'm gonna do. But I picture it happening more like that he goes to this mountain to have an encounter with God, and it doesn't happen in some dramatic, flashy way. There's no sign from God. But what does happen is he pours his heart out to God, believing that God cares for him, believing that God is listening. And he believes that God says something back. What are you doing here, man? You're okay? You're not alone? You're not alone. I know it's easy to believe that, but you're not. You know there are people who believe the same way you do. You're not alone in this resistance to these evil politicians. So go back to where you came from and do this, right? And he's like, yeah, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do boom, 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 boom. And he leaves with like 4 detailed action steps about what he's going to do now as he goes forward. Have you ever experienced anything like this? Yes. I would say many of us have. It's not that God spoke to you in an audible voice, but you were at a place in your life where you needed to hear from God. And maybe you wanted a flashy, dramatic sign. I get it. I have too. You wanted Superman to swoop in. But it didn't happen like that. But as you wrestled with it, probably over time, you shed tears, you prayed, you thought about it, you talked to trusted friends, you read the Bible, you sought, good, wise counsel, and all of a sudden it hit you. Like that's how we would say it, correct? It just hit me. I like, oh, that's what I need to do. And that process of wrestling with God and asking and seeking and looking for the right things to do and trying to make ethical decisions and what's true to me and what do I believe and what should I do here and how do I engage? No matter what it is that you're wrestling with, that process eventually led you to this realization. Now, there are people who don't engage in that process. There are people who make foolish decisions with their lives, and many people, we've all been there, right? Where we don't always practice listening to God or prayer or talking honestly about what's going on or wrestling with what we should do or how God is guiding us. There are people who do really dumb things. You could be the CEO of a tech company who is having an affair with your HR rep and you decide to go to a Coldplay concert. You could do that. And that did not work out too well, correct? Right? We can make all kinds of decisions. And so really over time, are you looking for that guidance? Are you looking to have an encounter with God? Do you want to hear from God? Are you prayerfully not super religiously expecting like to have a conversation like this with God, but are you wrestling with what God is calling you to do, with what the best decision to make is, with how you should engage in this world? And over time, perhaps you come to those realizations. I talk about my grandmother all the time in sermons. And if you're new, you may not realize that. If you've been around for a while, you're like, oh, he's talking about his grandma again. My maternal grandmother was an enormous influence on my life. And her name was Millie Elizabeth Boswell. Isn't that a great name for somebody born in the 1920s? Millie Elizabeth Boswell. And she was an amazing influence on my life. She attended a Methodist church in southeastern Ohio, where I was born. This is Appalachia, not far from West Virginia. And she rededicated her life to God in the late 1960s in a Methodist revival meeting, if you come from any tradition like that. And while lots of denominations don't allow a woman to preach or teach Bible study classes or so on, if you don't know that, believe it or not, that's true. Methodists allowed women to teach and preach and still do. And over a period of time, my grandma came to believe that God might be calling her to give sermons, to teach Bible study classes, or what we would call connect groups, or and preach like this. And she started to feel that perhaps that was the case. She started to feel like a draw toward that. And she certainly had the gifts for it. I know now, in retrospect, but this was in the 1970s in Appalachia, in the backwoods of Ohio, and that was not common there. And I had two uncles who were her sons-in-law, who were kind of the high-octane flavor of Baptists, who were vehemently opposed to a woman teaching or preaching in church. They believe that women should be silent in church. Again, if you don't come from a tradition where you're aware of this stuff, there are people who really believe this. And as a matter of fact, in their churches, women literally could not wear pants. They had to wear skirts or dresses to the worship service. And imagine, so my grandma is going through this time in her life where she feels that perhaps God is calling her to do what I'm doing right now, to give sermons or to teach a Bible study class. And she started to wrestle with that, knowing what the other people believed about that. And of course, they were not hesitant to share their opinions with her and assured her that she was not hearing from God and that God would never call a woman to preach. And this tormented her for months. She wrestled with this for months, tearfully, prayerfully. She was the kind of person, she got down on her knees next to the bed and prayed. And she told me this story. She said, I was a teenager when she told me this. She said she was standing in her kitchen one day where she spent a lot of her time. And she was stirring something or baking something. And she was tearfully praying about how she felt that perhaps God was calling her as a woman to teach and to preach. But there were people telling her it was a sin. And they told her with conviction, right? And she knew the conflict that was creating and what it would create, and just having people tell you that you're sinful for what for how God has made you and so on. It just deeply affects you. And she said she was standing in the kitchen, and she said, I heard a voice. And again, she's telling me this as a teenager. And she said, I'm not sure it was a voice, but I heard a voice. And she said, I'm not sure it was an audible voice, but it almost seemed like it. It was so real to me that I'm not saying I heard a voice, but I heard a voice. And as I was reading this passage this week, I was, this sounds like what Elijah was experiencing. She said, I was just standing in my kitchen alone after months and months of wrestling with this. And I don't know if it was a voice, but it spoke to me so clearly that it seemed like a voice. She said, and I imagine this may be meaningful to people here for lots of different reasons, right? She said, the voice, I'm not sure it was a voice, but the voice said, Millie, you do what I've called you to do. Some of you, oh my goodness, some of you have heard that voice. Maybe not a voice with your ears, but you've heard that voice. And in all likelihood, that's come after a long period of wrestling. I knew I should have brought Kleenex up here. I failed in my mission. I should have brought Kleenex up here. That probably came to you after a long period of wrestling, of prayerfully, perhaps tearfully, perhaps agonizingly wrestling with who you are, perhaps what God is calling you to do, a decision that maybe you have to make, or you want God to show up in some way. And finally, there was a realization. If you haven't experienced that, what I've experienced, if you're in a place where you're trying to encounter God, and you're like Elijah, you're hoping to hear something, but it's just not coming. What I have experienced is that hearing from God or encountering God and getting to some kind of realization often looks like a funnel, and you've probably been wondering what in the world this is the whole time. Is it a Devo hat, like Whip It Good? Is it, I went to Walmart looking for the largest funnel I could find. Do you think I succeeded? And let's be honest, it looks like a urinal. That's what I thought when I first saw it. So it says funnel, so we're gonna go with funnel. And I have found in my own life that getting to these realizations, where I don't know that it's a voice, but it's a voice, often looks like a funnel. And you imagine you have all kinds of options. Let's say you're trying to make a decision about something. You have all kinds of options. Maybe it's, like picture a bunch of marbles or something being thrown in here into the funnel. And if it's happening in slow motion, right? And you throw all these options in here. It's very wide at the top. There are all kinds of possibilities. All kinds of things could happen. All kinds of decisions you could make. Maybe you feel like you're kind of paralyzed by all the different options. Over time, what starts to happen is that things spin around in here. They rattle around, they bounce around. All of these options that get thrown into the wide top, they start to rattle, bounce around, spin around. And you know how this works. Over time, there's going to be something that starts to work its way to the bottom of the funnel. And here at this opening at the bottom of the funnel, that's where the realization takes place. I think that's what happened in Elijah's life. I think that's what happened in my grandma's life. I think that's what's happened before in your lives, those of you who can identify with what I'm talking about. If you're searching for God, if you want to encounter God, hear from God, I think this is what it often looks like. That you have all of these options and it's confusing and you're just not sure. It could be chaotic, but over time, what happens is, as you wrestle with it, as you look for guidance, as you think about it, let's say it's a work decision, and you're thinking it's a job change, a career change, okay? I have all these options, and you're like, wait a second, that one doesn't really fit my passion, but this one does, okay? So we're starting to rattle around now. The one that doesn't fit your passion, probably not the one that's going to come out come out the bottom. What about my experiences? What experiences have I had? What fits my personality? Right? Like what am I good at? What are my skills? Right? And all these things are bouncing around. So maybe some career choices. But pretty soon, or maybe months, some things are going to start to emerge as you prayerfully ask those questions. What fits me? God, what do you want me to do? And talking to friends and seeking wise counsel, something is going to pop out the bottom of that funnel. And when it does, you may be like, oh man, I can't believe I missed that. I can't believe it was such a hard decision. But it's tough because of what normally happens. What I think happened for Elijah here is that God usually speaks and works in your life, not instantly or dramatically, but over a period of time. And then you get to a place where you do have a realization at the bottom of the funnel that may feel dramatic to you. But that was after a long time of options rattling around in that funnel. And so over the course of this process, right, as you're wrestling with these things, as you're trying to, maybe you're troubled by what you see happening in our country and you're just not sure what to do. Like, what can I do here? What difference can I make? And maybe like Elijah, you're really zealous and you've jumped in and you're involved in all kinds of things and you feel like you're kind of burned out and anxious and discouraged. Or on the flip side, maybe you feel like you haven't done a whole lot and you're kind of wondering what you should do, but you also, the idea of it makes you feel anxiety. As we're in this process, like Elijah, we speak out and we allow God to accomplish good through us while living in a sustainable way. And so last week we talked about the rhythms of Elijah's life that the angel reminded him of: eating good food, drinking water, getting some physical movement. You need sleep, by the way. And then Elijah now has gone to this desert mountain to encounter God. And then he has this realization, you know what? I need to go back to the desert of Damascus where I came from, where my people are. Right? So there's this ebb and flow. There's this alone time and prayerful time. And then there's this engagement and action time. You see that in the life of Jesus as well. He ministered to people. He fed the 5,000. And then immediately he goes, it says in the New Testament, Jesus went off to a lonely place and prayed by himself. And so there's this ebb and this flow of a rhythm to life, of getting engaged and active and doing what God is calling us to do and not being afraid of that, but then also realizing we need to do that in a sustainable way. I've talked every week here about shoring up our ministries here over the summertime, and we have something to celebrate when it comes to volunteers here. We've been asking for volunteers in several areas. We have now 4 new volunteers in these ministries. Can we celebrate those 4 new volunteers? And road crew that sets up and takes down equipment here. Coffee bar, well kids, teachers and assistants. Well students, the same thing, teachers and assistants. Live stream with the technology back there. So we have 4 new volunteers, but these are ministries that we've focused on that really need some additional help. Some people who are willing to let God work through them. Like Elijah. And use their gifts and serve, but in a sustainable way. We don't want to burn people out here. And so if you're interested in any of those opportunities, let us know, info@wellchurch.org. And I talked about this over the past couple of weeks as well. In our Celebrate Recovery ministry, there's an option to have a children's ministry that coincides with Celebrate Recovery. And the kids actually get like child-appropriate recovery concepts to help prevent them from being in a place where they're struggling with hurts and habits and hang-ups so much. And we're looking for some volunteers for Celebration Place that would start at 11:15 during Celebrate Recovery. And if you're interested in that, let us know in those opportunities. But it's important, it's vitally important to realize that we get engaged and we get active like Elijah, but there's this rhythm to life as we seek to encounter God, or maybe we have the answer, but we don't want to burn out. And there's this rhythm to life. So at the beginning of the series, I said I want to share a little bit about my own life. I'm going to close with this and how I've experienced God working in difficult times. In 2012, my wife and I moved here from Ohio with our oldest son, who was just a tiny little guy at that time. And we started a church called One Church. And it took about a year from hitting the ground here to getting to weekly worship services, and I led that church for 5 years. I turned it over to our associate pastor at the time, Aaron Stritzel, who was in that picture I showed earlier when we relaunched the well, invited him back because I knew people would love to see him. And so early in the life of One Church, this is back in, again, 2012, 2013. I talked about starting a new church here, and it was in Chandler, and immediately, like, people would ask, are you, and this is before same-sex marriage was legalized, are you welcoming everybody? Like, how's that going to work? And I would tell people in one-on-one conversations, oh, yes, we are. And then, what kind of church is this? And it made it clear that, we believe that thinking people can take the Bible seriously when we interpret it in the light of its historical context. And you don't have to be afraid of questions and doubts. And faith and science don't have to be enemies. And, if God created you with a brain, it's okay to use it in church. Things like that, just trying to establish the culture. But I discovered that when we launched, it was, 100 and some, 125, 150 people that came. And I discovered that there were a lot of people who were just looking for, and I'll just be honest about it, they were looking for a small cornerstone, or they were looking for a small central Christian. They thought it was the same as some of the mega churches. They were just looking for smaller expressions of that. And so folks showed up, coming from those bigger churches, just kind of thinking, oh, this new little church is a smaller version of what I'm used to. And I don't need to tell you that's not exactly the case. There was a painful experience in that first year of, the people on the inside who helped launch the church. They knew exactly what it was. And I did my best, to communicate it. But it was a long time ago. And there was a particular Sunday where, I had to make it clear in the most gentle and, yes, Clark Kent way that I possibly could, that this is an open and affirming church. And what that means, and that's not the only thing about our church. Like, we believe in a way of looking at the Bible that allows thinking people to ask questions and be intellectually honest, and that God's not afraid of our brains. And in the next month after that particular sermon, 1/3 of the congregation left. Most of them were civil about it. There were hugs. There were people who wanted to meet with me. And basically they wanted to have lunch, and were like, did you mean what you said? I'm like, yeah. And then, okay, we're out. It was like that for a month. And 1/3 leaving, that's a big deal. That's a big deal. And the people who were left were like, what's going on? And there was a painful time. Now, the rest of that story is over the next few months. Even in 2013 in Chandler, Arizona, over the next few months, there were more people who heard about what that church was and who came than there were people who left. That's cool, right? Now, it didn't feel that way at first, right? And at the time, I guess it was, I'm getting old. I was in my late 30s. And at the time, and I felt the pressure from people questioning me and questioning my salvation, frankly. And I had a guy by the back door telling me I'm leading people to hell, and it got weird. And going through all of these difficult times, I'm proud to be able to say this, and I'm thankful to be able to say this, both. In all of that chaos and the difficulty of that, people in Chandler, Arizona realizing like, oh, wow, that's a different church. There wasn't one time when I thought, man, are we doing the right thing here? There wasn't. There wasn't one time. And that's not because I'm stubborn. I am stubborn. Okay, my wife's right over there. Okay, I'm stubborn. That's not why. It's because the decision to lead a church like this did not happen in a windstorm or an earthquake or a dramatic sign that was quick and easy and like the ones that we often look for. It didn't happen like that. It looked like a process of a bunch of things going through a funnel or whatever this is at the top over a period of years. Things like, what is the Bible? And when you encounter questions you have about the Bible, like, what do you do with those? Do you just try to harmonize them and dispatch them and pretend they're not there? Well, that's not being intellectually honest. Is God really afraid of our questions in our brains? I don't think so. and then talking to other people who are having similar thoughts, and then leaders around the country who are having similar thoughts and being inspired by them, and authors who are writing books. You know how this works, right? And having conversations with other people, like this guy over here, the guitar, Matt, and Jackie a long time ago, and hearing where their hearts are, and wait a second, I think God is doing something, right? And bouncing around for years and having conversations with people who felt ostracized by churches, who were, right? And wrestling with that for years, and finally coming out the bottom, realizing, wait a second, there's a better way. There's a better way. And being so sure of that got me through the difficult time. I didn't question it because it wasn't some big, dramatic, easy, quick sign, but it was something that God had been doing in my life for a long, long time. So if you are at a place in your life where you feel like you need that encounter with God and you're desperate for it, and I understand the temptation of looking for a quick, easy answer and a sign or Superman to swoop in, I get it. That's often not how God works. We're told here in the Hebrew, God spoke to Elijah, the voice of silence. Elijah poured out his heart to God. He'd been on a journey for a long time. He was seeking God. He went to where Moses met with God. He was intentional, looking for an encounter with God, looking for guidance. The guidance didn't come in an audible voice, but it came after a long time of wrestling and searching, and then those realizations came. I invite you to pray with me. God, thank you for an amazing passage that Jewish theologians have been teaching on for a long time, but that often got missed in sermons that I had heard, and I wish I would have heard it a lot sooner. Just plainly said, well, God perhaps didn't speak to the prophets of old in an audible voice, but there were realizations that came from God. We believe by faith they came from you, but that came to them after a long time of searching for them and wrestling with possibilities, wrestling with options like the top of a funnel. And then over time, what really makes sense, what is really from you, emerges. And that realization can feel dramatic. But for those of us who maybe hear people talk about stories and expect you to swoop in like Superman, that can be discouraging. So we pray, Lord, for those who feel like, and I don't know where I am in the funnel, but Lord, we are encouraged, emboldened to know that we're not alone in that process. That's where Elijah was. That is where so many heroes of the faith have been, and people that we know in our own lives. And maybe some of us here have experienced that before. And so God, we believe by faith that you hear us like you heard Elijah, and that you speak to us like you spoke to Elijah. And no matter where we are in that funnel, Lord, we want to keep focusing on you, believing that you are going to give us those realizations, that guidance. You are going to show up in the way that we need. It might be unexpected, but in the way that we need. And we thank you in Jesus' name. And everybody said,